Welcome to the stage, Rochelle Diamond.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the speaker series, whether you're in the room or online. So excited to have you here with us today for this event. I'm Rochelle Diamond. I'm on our employee experience team here at LinkedIn, and I am in it to make meaningful connections and create opportunities for inspiration, which is exactly what I get to do with the speaker series. So I feel so honored that this is what I get to run at LinkedIn. And I always like to remind you, you can see past speakers at speakers.linkedin.com. And we also have a podcast channel where you can download from iTunes. And we just passed 100,000 downloads of our podcasts from the past 40 events. So it's exciting, yeah. So what's even more exciting is that we have an amazing event for you guys today, and I have the honor of introducing not one, but two incredible women for this event. So Emily Chang, you may recognize her actually from some of her past experiences. She was a journalist, a correspondent in Beijing and London for CNN, where she won 5 regional Emmy Awards. If you didn't see her there, you may recognize her from being an anchor on Bloomberg Technology, which is a daily show about technology innovation and the future of business. She's actually going there right after this event to anchor that show. And she's had a chance to interview just such amazing people, from Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, to Malcolm Gladwell, Aaron Sorkin. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And if you don't recognize her from there, you may recognize her from the reporting and interviews she's done with companies like Hooli and Pied Piper. We have the pictures to prove it. So yes, Emily does play herself on HBO's Silicon Valley. So I thought that was kind of fun. So she's here with us today, of course, to talk about her book, Brotopia, Breaking Up the Boys Club of Silicon Valley. We're really interested to hear what she's learned about the gender inequality, and obviously an industry that's very near and dear to our hearts, technology, and what we can do about it. Interviewing Emily today is our very own Caroline Fairchild. She's the managing news editor on LinkedIn. She manages a group of reporters that create original content on news that matters most to professionals. And she specifically focuses on the technology space, so it's just perfect, and we're so honored and grateful that she's here today to talk to Emily. She's also interviewed some amazing people, also Sheryl Sandberg, Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, and that list goes on and on as well. So while Caroline has not been on Silicon Valley, she is a big fan of the show. And a fun fact is that after this interview, this will be the second cast member from Silicon Valley that she's spoken with. She had a chance to speak with Amanda Crew, who plays Monica on the show, for all you Silicon Valley fans out there. But with all of that, I'd love to welcome to the stage Emily and Caroline. Please put your hands together for a warm welcome. Really looking forward to the discussion.
I'm so excited to be here to have what I know is going to be a great conversation with Emily. Emily, to start, as we've prefaced, we didn't just bring her up here and didn't tell her about our little tradition, but we typically like to start our interviews by asking, what is one thing that we don't know about you from your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, it's so funny. That question I was like, oh my God, I don't do anything else. All I do is work. I have 3 children, 3 boys. The book's actually dedicated to them. I sing in the shower. I actually was in an a cappella group in college. And yeah, if you want to see me playing myself on television, it's actually harder than it looks. So stay tuned to the season 5 of Silicon Valley if you want to see a cameo or 2 of someone.
Yeah. And if Jeff were in the room, I'm sure he would make you demonstrate that special singing talent. But
So
I'm going to
really
give you a pass.
Jeff is not in the room, right?
Jeff, sorry, I'm not going to make Emily sing, but maybe we'll get her to do a native video on LinkedIn and upload that later. So your book, Brotopia, is fantastic and just came at this incredible time for this topic of gender inequality in Silicon Valley. But you've been covering Silicon Valley, talking to tech leaders now for over 8 years. What made you think this is the time? I need to write a book about this topic.
So I had no idea when I started writing 2 years ago that we would be in this moment. I had no idea President Trump would be elected. Trump had no idea he would be elected. There were a lot of things that were surprising. And the Me Too movement, really was unexpected. That said, when I launched the show 8 years ago, I've always been interested in women's issues, but it's interesting, at that time I was really more concerned with just getting people to agree to come on the show. Most people, they pick up the phone, they're like, Bloomberg, what? And over time, as we sort of built our reputation, I became more courageous, if you will, about asking, what are you doing to hire women? What are you doing to promote women? What are you doing to fund women? And it was sadly it was a controversial question, which it really shouldn't be. But at the end of 2015, I asked an investor, they had no women in their US investing business at the time, what are you doing to hire women? And he said, we're looking very hard, but we're not prepared to lower our standards. And that comment just hit me.
And what year was that?
That was the end of 2015.
Yeah, okay.
Hit me like a ton of bricks, and everywhere I went, people wanted to talk about what he had said. And I realized that this is a very, it's a very personal topic, it's an emotional topic, but generally in front of the camera and under stage lights, you're not going to get a very in-depth answer. And if I really wanted to explore, it had to be done in a book. And it could have been so many things. It could have been a story about one woman or 12 amazing women or one company. But as I was doing my research, I just realized there's so much about how and why we got here that we don't know, that we can't just sort of whitewash or pinkwash the last 30 or 50 years. We really need to understand the root of this problem if we are going to move forward and change it.
And I definitely want to get to some of the issues around meritocracy, which is kind of pervasive around Silicon Valley. But before then, you do mention in the book, like what you said, that leaders would talk about it off camera, but once you got them under those heated lights, there'd be some very scripted answers. Why is that? The numbers are the numbers, we know what they are. Why are leaders in tech kind of giving still these kind of just blanket statements about what they're doing to make change?
Right. So I hope that is changing. But, I agree that, look, let's put it out there. Women hold 25% of jobs across the industry. They account for 7% of investors. Women-led companies get 2% of funding. This is in an industry that styles itself as a meritocracy. I don't think that women have only 2% of good ideas. And so I do think that the whole belief that Silicon Valley is changing the world, and in many ways it is and it has been almost an impediment to solving this problem. There's been a lot of wealth and power amassed here in a very short period of time, and I think that's led to a sense of entitlement and, quite frankly, arrogance and moral exceptionalism that has prevented many of the leaders in Silicon Valley from being willing to admit that maybe we're part of the problem. Maybe we have to change. And I do believe that the people who are changing the world and taking us to Mars and building self-driving cars, changing the way we communicate and how we shop, they can hire women, they can pay them fairly, they can fund their ideas. That's not too hard a problem for Silicon Valley to solve.
And to get to that conclusion, throughout the book, you kind of go back through history and talk about certain historical moments like the dot-com bust and things like that, when there weren't that very many women making decisions. And you talk about how those historical moments could have been different if there was more diversity of thought around the table. What did you discover in terms of why that was important, in terms of having different perspectives making decisions?
I mean, there are so many studies that I think get constantly overlooked, that diverse teams have better results. Diverse teams are more creative. Diverse teams make more money. There's a study from the IMF in chapter 9, which is like the solutions chapter of the book, where they found that if you add a woman to a board or to an executive team, profitability goes up by 3 to 8%. Why? I'm like, why isn't anyone talking about this? These studies get so conveniently overlooked. It is impossible to prove a hypothetical. We can't say, well, if women were at the table 30 years ago, this is how the world would have or could have been different. But we can certainly speculate. For example, I interviewed Ev Williams, the co-founder of Twitter, who told me that if women had been on the early Twitter team, maybe online harassment and trolling wouldn't be such a problem. He said we just weren't thinking about that when we were building Twitter. We were thinking about wonderful and amazing things that could be done with it, not how it could be used to send death threats or rape threats. Like, just imagine how different the world might be if that wasn't as big a problem as it is today, or if video games weren't so violent, or porn wasn't so ubiquitous, or we had better parental controls on things like YouTube. And where we are now is, we're at the risk of sort of rewriting all of the discrimination and bias that already exists into AI and machine learning and the algorithms of the future. And we're already seeing, like, facial recognition technology is sexist and racist. It doesn't recognize women and people of color as easily as it does white men. And so that's, just one small example of something that I think could and would be different if we had people of all backgrounds building and designing these products.
And if you look back at the history of technology, some of the issues that you explore in the book, women were at the table, but they somehow got written out of history entirely. If you think about the founding of the internet, for example, you write about how there were a lot of key women there, but their names were somehow forgotten. How and why did that happen? And how can we prevent that in 2018 from happening again?
Yeah, that to me was like the smoking gun. And it was when I dove into the history that I personally learned a lot. So if you go back to the 40s and 50s, women actually played vital roles in the computing industry. They were programming computers for the military and programming computers for NASA. And it literally was hidden figures, but industry-wide. And then in the 60s and 70s, as the tech industry was exploding, they were so desperate for new talent. And this idea that a computer programmer is born, not trained, or born not made, or that you're just sort of born with this natural skill to do this job became ingrained. And a software company called SDC hired 2 psychologists to develop a personality test to identify good programmers. And they decided that good programmers, quote, don't like people. Well, if you look for people who don't like people, the research tells us you'll hire far more men than women. I'm really glad you've laughed at that. But in all seriousness, there's no evidence to support the idea that people who don't like people are better at this job than people who do, or that men are better at this job than women. In fact, there's a great argument to be made that we need people who do care about and understand people to be making these products and services so that they can solve the problems for the users on the other side. But this idea of the antisocial, mostly white, male nerd stereotype perpetuated over decades, and these tests were used by companies as big as IBM, and not only did it impact what we thought made it for a good computer programmer, but who made for a good entrepreneur. People were looking for people who look like Bill Gates and look like Mark Zuckerberg, which quite frankly shuts out more than half the population. And I like to think how different the world might be if a woman, or I think about all the women who didn't get a chance to start the next Facebook or the next Google or the next Apple. And it's really easy to say, oh, look at all these amazing companies and all the wealth and cool things they've created. But maybe, we could be living in an alternate and better universe if women had been there from the start.
And what you're talking about there is pattern matching, which is something that we've noticed in technology. That's why the funding goes to mostly white male founders, things like that. Throughout your reporting, who's doing this right? Who's figuring out ways to not fall into that trap of, oh, I'm just going to take that deal because that guy looks like Mark Zuckerberg or went on, my son's Stanford golf team or whatever it is, those type of ingrained cultural biases?
So the book is not entirely depressing. There are bright spots. There are people doing things well. There are, many men, who admit the mistakes that they made in the early days and, talk about what they're doing to change things and how they're running their companies differently today. There are also some amazing women, and I like to look at the companies run by women like Stitch Fix and Rent the Runway and Eventbrite, where actually they're 50-50. So just having strong female role models leads to more women who want to work there and who are working there. In the last chapter, I really dive into Slack as an example, where Stuart Butterfield, he's very sort of woke to the idea that he's quite privileged as a white man who had an exit and has this amazing network. And he really has sort of made hiring and promoting women and underrepresented minorities an explicit priority. And so every time he tweets about it, they get a spike in inbound interest. And so, not only has he been explicit about it, but it's it's communicated throughout the different levels of the organization, this is really important to us, this is important to Stuart, and therefore we have to get this done. And so there's a lot of prescriptive things in that chapter about specifically things that they have done to achieve this, and they're 43% women, which is far better than the industry average. It's not perfect, but I do think that being explicit about it is so important, and leading from the top is so important. I was so glad when Jeff Weiner liked the invitation to this event. I was like, yay! That matters. That really matters.
Mm-hmm. And it's very clear that leaders in technology care about this issue. I think there are probably, hopefully, very few CEOs of large technology companies who don't understand that this is a problem and want to fix it. But the numbers are barely moving. Other than the meritocracy issue, which we've talked about, what are some of the other big barriers that make this, the too hard to solve problem for Silicon Valley?
So first of all, everyone blames the pipeline, and I make an argument in the book that the tech industry created the pipeline problem by having this very narrow idea of who can do this job. And women actually, in computer science, the percentage of women studying computer science peaked in 1984 at 37%. It has since plummeted to now 18%, where it's been flat for the last decade. So they were there. They essentially sort of got pushed and profiled out. There's been zero movement, and it's about the same sort of decline in percentage of tech jobs. That said, yes, there is a pipeline problem today, but the tech industry is reinforcing that problem. And part of that is just, there's so much work that the industry can do to keep and promote and progress the women that we have here today. One of the most another shocking piece of data was around sort of work, family, and when women leave the tech industry. Women are twice as likely to quit tech as men are. They're not leaving to take care of their kids. They're not going home to their families. They are taking jobs in other fields. They're 807% more likely to leave tech than they are to leave jobs in other fields. And again, when I was reading this data, I'm like, what? Why isn't anyone talking about this? This is insane. And so, there's so much that, companies, I think, and people can do to just create environments where women want to be and feel valued and are continuing to learn. And at the very end of the book, this was one of my favorite parts of the book, I interviewed 6 teenage girls who've all learned how to code. And they're so excited. They're so excited to do their part to change the world. But they're also really scared because they read the news. And I was surprised by how well-informed they are. There was one girl who said, I heard that Travis Kalanick was meditating in the lactation room at Uber. What is that about? And
you needed to meditate. It was a hard year.
This was before that year. They know Sheryl Sandberg is the only Sheryl Sandberg. One of them said, I'm in this Women in Tech group, and they all talk about being mansplained. And so the tech industry, you can't be what you can't see, right? And I do think that people in Silicon Valley, these companies, you all can do so much more to be something that they see that they can be, right?
And on that theme of you can't be what you can't see, this is an issue that's really important to my heart, and I know yours, is how the media portrays women who have made it to the top in technology. In the book, you outline that crazy media coverage of when Marissa Mayer of Yahoo only took a couple weeks of maternity leave after having twins when she became CEO of Yahoo, and just how the media just annihilated her for that decision. Talk to us about what is dangerous about how the media sometimes covers women in tech differently than men.
So, first of all, the problem is that there just aren't enough women in leadership positions in general. And so the women who are there get over-scrutinized for things that are just, in my view, not fair game. If Marissa was a man having a child in however many weeks or months, that it was, no one would have even known.
Someone pointed out to me yesterday that Elon Musk has 5 kids. Did anyone here even know that he had children? Why?
He has 5 sons.
Yes.
He has 5 sons. When she ended the work from home policy, that became another flashpoint, and she had all of her reasons. And I think if she was a man, it wouldn't have gotten such coverage. I went back and I looked at some of the coverage of Lean In and Sheryl as well, and I found this one headline that said, Sheryl Sandberg and Marissa Mayer, are they setting back the cause of working moms? And I was like, what? To me, no one expects, they need to be critiqued. They are leaders of multi-billion-dollar businesses. We shouldn't be treating them with kid gloves, but let's be fair in how we sort of dole out the criticism. And there are other women like Susan Wojcicki at YouTube who nobody knows enough about. She is amazing, and she has 5 kids, and she, convinced Google to buy YouTube and DoubleClick, and now she runs YouTube Today, but she's not out there talking about it. Mm-hmm. And so,
and she was Google's first landlord, basically.
Right. And there's a whole chapter on Google and the different management styles that they all brought to the company. But I do think that the stories we tell about women matter. And so I made it sort of an effort to reshape the stories as we know them in that part of my book. And I do think that the media has a big role to play here. And Bloomberg and we are actually doing a lot more to make sure that we're better representing women's voices, not about women's issues, but about the hard work that they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of Marissa, one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, you talk about, there was a columnist when she was at Stanford who wrote about, it was like some parody column, correct?
So it was like kind of Carrie Bradshaw-ish column written every week about some funny cultural thing.
And Marissa was referenced, but she was referenced as the outstandingly attractive woman in the upper division computer science class. And she told Emily that it wasn't really until that moment that she realized, oh, I am the only blonde woman in this computer science class at Stanford. I think that that's interesting when we talk about representation, because I'm sure there are many people in the audience and on the screen who might be one of only, maybe not on their team, but in a meeting or whatever it is. Do you have any advice for, given the numbers are the numbers, how you can, while we're in this transition of trying to get more diversity in tech, how being a person of diversity in those situations, how to thrive?
So I do think in general, finding your allies and finding your team is so important in any organization. And, depending on who those people are, those are people who can help support you and help you get things done. But ultimately, I think we all want to be in places where we can be ourselves and be authentic. And there were so many times where women told me, I was told to wear my hair in a ponytail, not to get my nails done, no jewelry, wear black and gray. And that's not necessarily what what a lot of women want to do. And so I am a big advocate of finding a place that will support you and allow you to be yourself. And if that's not this place, and hopefully it's not, there are so many places out there that are desperate for good talent. And so especially when it comes to women and underrepresented minorities, it's know your value. You have so much to offer. And if you're not being valued where you are, you can certainly find that somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of company culture, one of the, I would say, tenets of Silicon Valley has become this notion that you need to work these grueling hours, just working around the clock in front of the computer. It's not very sustainable for someone who, say, has a family or any hobbies outside of work. Connect to us why that's dangerous to, I don't think a day goes by that I don't see some founder or VC on Twitter bragging about how much they're working. Why is that how is that not helping this problem?
The sort of work hard thing has become, a trope in Silicon Valley, but and that the word balance is bad. I don't know. I don't think balance is bad. I think balance is good. I think we all have lives outside of this, and whether that's kids or, you like to exercise or you want to see your friends, I think it's so important to be able to do that, to recharge. And I do think that it can be so easy for companies to try to do everything for people so that they never leave. And we should want people to leave the office and to go out and experience the world, because you do burn out, and you can burn out. And I just don't think that culture is necessarily healthy and also conducive to building a mature organization. You want people of all backgrounds and ages. I think ageism in tech is very underreported. There's not a lot of data about it. I tried to report on that more in my book, but the data just hasn't been collected. But there are so many dads that I talk to who are like, I'm 38 and I have 3 kids and I feel so uncool when I can't, say yes to dinner with Mark Zuckerberg. So I do think just being more realistic about when we're at work and when we're not at work, Sheryl Sandberg has some interesting things that she does when she got so much publicity for leaving work at 5:30. She doesn't stop working at 5:30. She gets back on. She sends emails. If she's sending an important email, she'll red flag it. If it's not important, then you don't have to respond. And so I do think it's sort of building those kind of even just small things into your process, so that we don't burn out and we are sort of mindful of the lives we have outside of work.
And speaking of building, collaborative and good company cultures, there was one woman who very famously did not find that at where she was working. Of course, I'm talking about Susan Fowler. For those who are on the stream in the room and don't know, Susan Fowler is the former Uber engineer who wrote the blog post that went around the world that changed Uber's trajectory and pretty much Silicon Valley in general. I wanted to ask you how you feel like the conversation has changed since that moment.
So that was about a year and a half into writing the book. And I was actually on maternity leave, and I was seeing all of this happen, and I was like, oh my God, I realized I've done so much work to get people like Sheryl Sandberg and Marissa Mayer and Reid Hoffman to talk to me, but I need to talk to the people who are on the ground, the rank and file. But it's actually it's harder to get those people to talk because you all have jobs, you all have a boss, and you all have to worry about when you're talking to the press and how that's going to be construed. And so 3 weeks after Susan's post, I managed to get 12 women across the industry, most of them engineers, to come to my house for dinner. And we just started talking. And they didn't, I was sort of very upfront. If you want to be on the record or off the record, just say before you speak, no expectations. And they really opened up. And I think because they had sort of the support of the group, they opened up more than they maybe had planned to. First of all, none of them were surprised by Susan's post. They were like, I'm living this every day. I'm the only woman in a room over and over again. And this is the chapter where we explored race and sexuality and intersectionality and how, we had, women, Black women, Latino women, women who didn't go to college, transgender, how, whether if you're a double or a triple minority, how that can sort of double or triple just how exhausting it is for you to sort of feel like you have to prove yourself over and over again. And I do think that was the theme, is that they felt that they had to be exceptional and sort of over and over again do all of this emotional labor to prove why they deserved to be there. And they all had thought about leaving tech, but they all, again, love their jobs and love their opportunity to change the world. And so, that was for me just a really, it was such a good example of, they want to stay, they want to be here. There's so much that we can do to create a better culture for them. There's an amazing quote from a woman named Lydia Fernandez, who's transgender. And for the first 20 years, she was presenting as a man. And she actually started working in tech, and then she transitioned. And she does not hold back. She said, I have had 20 years of life experience validating that my opinion is worth hearing. And as soon as I started presenting as a woman, people just started interrupting me. She's like, this game is rigged. I've sat on both sides of this table. And so it was just, not a lot of people can say that. So, I just think that there's so much that we can all do to, make these environments more comfortable for people of all backgrounds, because we want people of all backgrounds to be represented in the products that we're developing. You asked what people can do earlier. I do think we cannot always expect the victim, or whoever it is, to speak up when they're having a problem. So if you see someone being interrupted or being mansplained or whatever splained it is, or not getting an opportunity when maybe they should, say something. It can be so much more effective, whether it's man-to-man or just outside of that maybe immediate moment, hey, that wasn't cool, or hey, maybe we should think about this, to make progress.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of progress, I want to get back to what you said about when you had all those 12 engineers over to your house and none of them were surprised by Susan Fowler's blog post. I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room who read this since we work in tech and read it and kind of were like, oh yeah, that happens. We know from LinkedIn surveys that a majority of people, of our members, a majority of people in startups and in venture capital have witnessed episodes of sexual harassment or abuse. And we also know from the same survey that the tech industry feels like the media spends too much time on this issue. So how can we not be surprised by this? The media is spending all this time, too much time covering it, and it's still an issue. What's missing here?
It's interesting. I do think that in some ways on these issues you have to over-rotate in order for change to actually happen. And I have been so honored and heartened that companies have wanted to bring me in to talk about this. I mean, obviously I take a pretty strong stand. My book is called Brotopia. And yet, I've talked to Microsoft and Amazon, and I'm so honored to be here today. And employees come up to the microphone and they're fired up. And so I do think just being willing to have that conversation is so important. I came into this, honestly, without an agenda. I'm a journalist. I have, for my entire career, been trained to be objective, have no opinion. But ultimately, when I finished the book, there were a lot of things I saw that were very problematic, and I knew that it wouldn't be worth it if I didn't take a stand and didn't say what I felt had to be said. And so what I hope is that this is a spark to get people talking. The book has been an interesting confluence. A male tech CEO actually said this to me. He's like, I feel like your book is like 50% of people had no idea this was happening or just didn't know how bad it was. And 50% of people are like, thank God someone is finally speaking up for me. And so now, let's talk.
Yeah, let's have those two parties talk together. And you do at the end of the book come up with some recommendations. And I thought it was interesting to note that your first recommendation is, quote unquote, people need to be nice to each other. It's like a list of items, and the first one is be nice to each other. It's 2018. Why? Explain to us why that was something you felt like you needed to outline.
Unfortunately, I think some of the most common sense things aren't happening, and I call those things the bare minimum. There was an amazing, I don't know if any of you saw that amazing Medium post that was, for all of these men who are wondering how we should treat women and don't know if they should hug or handshake or if we can even meet alone in a room, just treat all women like you would treat Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Would you stroke his cheek? Would you touch his hair? Would you invite him to,
Yeah.
So I honestly think that was
that seems like a basic recommendation.
Exactly. Maybe in the paperback.
Exactly.
I just felt like that just perfectly sort of encapsulated. I do think most people know where the line is, and so you know what line not to cross. Not to go too close to that line. And there have been many egregious examples of people behaving badly. I don't think that is the biggest part of the problem. That is a big problem. But the biggest part of the problem is the little things that pile up that are really difficult to call out, really difficult to pinpoint, and much more systemic that everyone in this room is dealing with for some reason or another.
And so many women, you spoke to so many women for this book who have dealt with these issues, inherent bias, things like that. Any advice really stick out for you in terms of how to navigate, how to deal with that coworker who strokes your cheek or doesn't refer to you by...
So that, I just would not put up with that for one hot second. So many women have said to me, do I come forward? And that is just such a case-by-case thing, and it's very, very personal. And there are so many different avenues for you to address something like that, whether that is telling someone or telling your boss, or of course going to the media is like the nuclear option. But I go back to just finding your team and finding people who will support you. I do think that right now people are being listened to more than they ever have. So if you have something to talk about, now is the time. And I know that as I've been giving talks at these companies, one CEO who was in the room said, look, if you have a problem with me, if you have a problem with someone, I know it's a heavy burden, but it's on you to tell somebody about it. And if it's a problem with me, go to our board. If it's a problem with so-and-so or someone, come to me. And so, I think nobody wants to be on the wrong side of this issue right now, and whether they're doing that because of public pressure or because they really believe or have good intentions, I almost don't care. Because I do think that it's going to take all of those things together to make real change. If you have 6 men around a dinner table and you swap in 1 woman, the conversation changes slightly, right? If it's half and half, it's a completely different conversation. And I do think we need to aspire to 50-50 if we're going to have a real culture change, whether that's in a company or around a venture capital table. Realistically, that is what is going to make the difference.
Mm-hmm. And despite how much attention this issue is getting and what the research is telling us about the importance of diversity and diverse teams, there are likely some people listening who are kind of like eye-rolling this issue, unfortunately. What would you say to them?
I do think we need to create safe spaces to talk about these issues. And I know not everyone will agree with what I have to say, but I'm perfectly willing to listen to you if you'll listen to me. And so I think it is a matter of, bringing people into these conversations. I've heard a lot about fears about the white male revolt. I actually don't think that's as big a risk as some people think it is. And I've been talking to a lot of CEOs and the head of engineering teams, and there are the people that I'm, generally this is a self-selecting audience. The people that I'm talking to want to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And so, read the book.
Yeah.
If you want an independent third party, I've written 300 pages about why this is a problem. And at this point, I think ignorance can only be willful. Like, we know, whether you've read this or you've read one of the many, many, many articles about it, we can no longer say, oh, I had no idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to open it up to questions here in a few minutes. Everyone, please get your questions for Emily ready. Before I do, I have a couple more. We've talked a lot about the problems.
Yeah.
What's made you optimistic as you've gone on this book tour? What have you seen? What interviews have you had recently that lead you to believe that we are on the right side of history, as you say?
So first of all, people are so excited about what they can do, and the questions are always very action-oriented. What can I do? What can my company do? I love this sort of evolving idea of when you're hiring, looking for people who are a cultural addition rather than a culture fit. And I do think that word culture fit can be a very sort of insidious term that can be used as an excuse to exclude people. But by thinking about it as a cultural addition, you're sort of acknowledging you value the culture that you've created, but you want to expand that culture. There have been so many incredible sideline initiatives, whether it's Founders for Change, and there's a really active group of now female investors and female entrepreneurs who've been doing all of this behind the scenes work to get some new movement started. So Founders for Change is founders committing to consider the diversity of a firm when taking money. Yep. So does that firm have a woman or a person of color in a position of writing a check? Mm-hmm. And some of the top firms don't make the cut.
Yesterday.
There's another initiative called Moving Forward, which is getting VCs to commit to make their discrimination and harassment policies public, which sounds simple, but actually some of them don't have any. And so even just writing them down is an important exercise. I've also heard Mark's sister at Upfront Ventures, they sort of have their own version of the inclusion rider that Frances McDormand talked about at the Oscars, where if they're giving a term sheet to a company, they're asking that company to commit to certain diversity initiatives. And I actually had one of their founders come up and talk to me at the end of an event, and he said, we only have 6 people, but 2 of them are women and 2 of them are people of color. So it worked.
Wow, that's great. And I also wanted to ask you, you obviously spend your time, your living, interviewing people, but because of this book, you're in the other seat. As you've gone through this book tour, what's either the best or maybe the worst question that you've gotten?
Oh my God, that's tough. I mean, I can't say any question is a bad question.
Yeah. Very nice of you.
Well, we're all learning. I mean, it's been so fascinating to be on the other side. I've gotten the question a lot about, what about women who hold other women back? Are you going to write, when I started writing the book, there were some people who said, are you going to write a chapter about bad women bosses?
Queen bee.
Yeah. And I researched it a little bit. And ultimately, there are bad men bosses too, but bad women bosses have become like a trope because they are so rare. And, the research shows that if there's one woman on a board or one woman on an executive team, women in general are much more competitive with each other because they think there's only room for one. But if there's 3 or 4, they're much more likely to help each other. And so I do think there are just so many systemic factors at play that have led to the trope of the queen bee. And I was kind of like, that just doesn't work for my thesis. I'm not even going to go there. And I really want to celebrate the contributions that women can make, and that we all can make if we, stop changing the world alone. Let's change the world together.
That's great. Let's definitely change the world together and take it to questions from the stream. We have a mic here in the room. Anyone?
I'm not on the stream, but I got a question.
You're here in person. Hi. Hello.
Hey, thanks so much for coming and talking with us. My name's Matt. How much exploration and research have you done into how much and how the Silicon Valley compares to this problem compared to other industries where there are large concentrations of wealth? We've got like banking industry or stock industry or the example of our current president. How do you think we compare and why the focus on Silicon Valley?
I'm so glad you asked that question because so many people said, Silicon Valley can't possibly be worse than Wall Street. Well, actually it is. The top banks actually are about 50-50. They have a lot of work to do with when it comes to women in leadership, and of course Wall Street is not perfect. You're right that sexism, sexual harassment exists everywhere. I don't think it matters anywhere as much as it does in Silicon Valley because this industry is so powerful, is changing everybody's lives every single day, and I think the billions of people who are using your products don't think about who's making them. And so, in a way, it's a call to action, and somebody should write a book about what's going on in Hollywood and what's going on in Washington, and I'm sure some people are. But to me, I felt like I couldn't. Someone asked, why didn't you write a book about all these industries? And sort of sometimes when you try to write about everything, you ultimately end up with nothing. And I really felt like this was a very important topic that only 30 years from now will we realize sort of how important this moment was or has been. And my biggest hope is that this isn't just a moment, that this really is a movement. But again, I think that the smartest people, the wealthiest people in the world can do this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Emily. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. My name is Caroline, and I am new to LinkedIn and new to the workforce in general. I just graduated 10 months ago. So actually, thank you so much for writing this book, because I think it's a really important conversation, and I've been kind of carting it around with me because I work on an all-male team to try to prompt organic discussion around it.
You're like, hey, want to talk?
And,
I love that.
I've noticed, though, generally that when prompted, men are very positively responsive to it. And what I've noticed is that I've also go to a lot of women in tech empowerment conferences. And what I've noticed is that the messaging around these discussions is not always inclusive of men. And sometimes it discourages men from coming when they actually should and need to be a part of the conversation. So one of the questions is how do we make the messaging around these important discussions sort of inclusive of men? And how do we get them equally as ramped up to have these discussions on a daily basis or on a micro level?
I do think the best argument is that this isn't just the right thing to do, which I believe it is, but it is the smart thing to do. So I had a chief security officer of a huge tech company say, I have to give a speech about this, and I really believe it's important, but how do I reach these people? And I said, well, do you think we'd be more safe if there were more women in cybersecurity? He was like, absolutely. I was like, seems to be a perfect argument to me. You're speaking to people who really care about security and, probably believe that we're at threat level, double red. If we had more people of all backgrounds who have different sort of risk profiles, then, maybe we wouldn't be at threat level red, orange, whatever it is. And so personally, I think that is the most compelling argument. There's a lot of examples of how people are tackling this problem, but Dick Costello, for example, when he went to start his company after Twitter, and he's really of the mind that, look, if you wait too long and the company gets too big, and then you try to get the numbers back to, closer to where you want them to be, it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier. So when he started his next company, he wouldn't hire another man until he'd hire a woman, and vice versa. And he was like, actually, it enabled us to move faster because we didn't have to go onto the street to ask people what they thought of the product. We could just ask people who were in the room. So, I do think even though it will require some patience in the short term, in the long term, it will completely pay off. I mean, in general for me, and it's interesting because my team has ebbed and flowed over the years, but was actually all women until about a year, for a period of time until about a year ago. And we hired a man, and I could like instantly see new perspectives, new ideas, new pitches that, I'm like, oh, why didn't we just didn't talk about that stuff normally. And so, personally, I think some of this stuff, once we do have more diverse teams, the value of that will be much more, quickly visible. But in general, I think it's about building the best product. And that, to me, is the best argument to make.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I just have to tell you that throughout this whole event, I keep getting emails and messages from people that are watching on the stream thanking me for bringing you here and for coming, thanking you for being a part of this.
And thank you, honestly, all of you for being in this room. And I know we have all different kinds of people in the room. So that really means a lot to me. And
You're making an impact on a lot of people right now. It's very clear. So thank you. From the stream, there's one comment I wanted to read and then a question, and actually a couple more just popped in, so I'll read those. So someone wanted to call out that there's a podcast called Note to Self that's very related to this session. They're currently doing a series called Women Owning It Online. So we wanted to make sure everyone knew that. And then we had a question about education and how women are doing better in school than men and the gap is increasing. And was wondering, let me see, they're completing more undergrad, grad level degrees than men, and do you think this will have any effect going forward?
Well, I certainly hope it does. You're right, more women are graduating from college than men are. There are so many talented women out there, and what's fascinating is that actually in the 70s, when medicine and the law were still very male-dominated, they sort of went in the opposite direction, and tech just went completely off course, and it is the only major where today you see such a stark gender disparity. I think the next is math, where it's about 40-60. There is some work that companies are doing, and I was speaking at Redfin recently, and they actually started an internal organization to work with mid-career coding groups where women and underrepresented minorities are learning how to code, but maybe not in the traditional getting a bachelor's degree sense.
And their CTO is a woman.
Right. Well, and they started out with Bridget, was one of 15. She was the only woman, and now they're like 35% women on engineering, which is huge. And I think their engineering team is like hundreds of people. And so what they've done is they have this organization at Redfin where they then bring those people in and act as a sort of bridge and train them to get them ready to be, part of the organization. And so I do think it's like where there's the will, this can happen, and I think it's a perfect example of how you can move the numbers in very extreme ways if you make it a priority.
Great, thank you. Does someone else have a question? Because I have another one. I'll keep going. So how do you think companies should handle fostering and facilitating internal conversations around things like Susan Fowler's memo or the Google memo?
That's, I think, very company dependent. I totally think that we need to create spaces where people can feel comfortable talking about it, but I agree that it doesn't help if women are just talking about this alone. And I do think women support groups are really important, but I think bringing men into that conversation is just as, if not more important. And I don't know how you curate those conversations. Maybe it's listening sessions of sorts with executives, but to me that seems like a pretty easy thing to do. What you don't want is for it to turn into like a BITCH fest or something like that. But so it's a matter of making sure those conversations are productive, but knowing that there probably is going to be a lot of emotion and a lot of strong opinions, and being ready and willing to hear it.
Great, thanks.
Hi. Thanks for coming. Thinking about the pipeline issue, what would you think about hypothetically giving coding classes in high school? Would that sidestep whatever the ratio is in university, because all of a sudden every new high school graduate is coding proficient? And if yes, and if you were in charge of the educational system, which class would you drop in favor
I like how you're now
of
in
a
charge
coding
of the
class?
entire education system.
Oh my God,
Journalist,
that's really hard.
author, Fowler turned head of education.
So, like I said, there's another book about ageism, there's another book about racism, there's another book about the education system, and there is some really hard work that needs to be done there. There's an amazing organization called Code.org, which is trying to get more high school students and girls especially learning how to code, and the way that they're doing it is actually retraining teachers that are already there. So rather than trying to bring in new teachers, it's you already work at the school, do you want to learn how to do it? Let's teach you, and then you can then pass that down. It's interesting. I mean, one of the students I talked to it was a high school in San Mateo. I'm not sure what the name. She said that the coding classes they're exploding in size. Of course, this is in the Bay Area, and that it's actually now hard to get in because they don't have enough teachers. So I absolutely do think that this needs to be a priority. I mean, and there's so many things wrong with the U.S. education system. We spend, way less on education, for example, as a percentage of our income than China. I mean, the numbers are just so extreme. And so, I certainly think that our government needs to make it more of a priority. In general, I think coding is actually ultimately going to become more of a commodity where, everyone ultimately, we're still far away from there, but everyone will learn how to code, just like they learn a language. And the critical thinking skills and creativity and innovation is going to become even more important. And so that's why having people of all backgrounds is going to become even more important, because the technical skills are going to be a given. Oh my goodness, as to what class I would drop, I have no idea.
I mean, I was an English major, public policy minor, so I mean, I'm trying, high school class was the question?
I'm just trying to think of a class that I hated.
Yeah.
I really want to say PE, but that is not popular in a world where obesity is like a really big problem.
Thanks.
Okay, we have another from the stream. Here we go. I know you spoke about investment banking earlier when you were talking about other industries and the balance of women in leadership. The question is about, is there an industry that is a good example for the tech industry to follow? So I don't know if that's investment banking or something else that you would want to elaborate on.
So the investment banking industry is actually a very interesting example, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but in the 80s and 90s, they had this problem, and they did a lot of things to change it. So that is an example of this is not impossible. It's a very big industry, very powerful people and resources, and they have made efforts to change. And I actually think being a woman on Wall Street is a completely different experience than being a woman in tech, and in many cases in a much better way. One of the things that's interesting, and I was talking to a very senior executive at Goldman Sachs about this, is I said, why is the tech industry so bad when it could have been so good? It's a young industry, heart of the left-leaning West Coast, young people who presumably are very progressive on these issues. And he said, well, first of all, it is a young industry, so a lot of times it's the immaturity and sort of the problems that just sort of have to work themselves out. But there is the whole changing the world idea has been, in a sense, an impediment. People in Silicon Valley are like, but we're changing the world. How can we be part of the problem? When on Wall Street, we're just trying to make a lot of money, and we're pretty upfront about that. People in Silicon Valley are trying to make a lot of money too. So let's get over ourselves a little bit and admit that we're also part of the problem and can be part of the change if there's the will.
Now, so if anyone has any questions, you guys can enter them on the stream if you're online, or anyone in the room want to take this opportunity to ask a question. Do we have one over here? Oh, great. All right. Come on down.
So I struggle with this idea that as women, we're force-fitting into an industry that is built by men for men versus rewriting the rules. And just would love to hear your thoughts on that idea.
I absolutely think we need to rewrite the rules. And it's funny, Bill Gurley, the benchmark capital investor, always says you have to play the game that's on the field. I think you have to play the game that's on the field, but try to change the rules of the game as we go. I don't think you can just say, we're going to change all the rules right now, and that's necessarily going to be received well. But I do think that as we go about this, there's sort of a healthy balance of, dealing with what we have and figuring out sort of how to change it and make it better along the way. And so whether that's, starting with conversations and leading to some initiatives and doing experimentation and seeing how things work. I absolutely do, I think that Sheryl Sandberg and her lean in philosophy, like that was a very important message. I know for me as a woman that resonated, but there's so much more that the industry can do to change so that women, when they're leaning in, aren't leaning into a door that is nailed shut. So, absolutely, I don't think that this is about women fitting in. In fact, I think this is about women trying to help, speaking up to make workplaces better fit them. And not just them, but people of all backgrounds. I mean, we all have our own sort of identity, which our own ball and chain, our own things that make us feel marginalized. And there are so many problems in how this industry has been built for mostly young, white, male, childless people right out of college that just doesn't necessarily suit everyone. For example, I've been asked a lot about alcohol at startups and in general, and I'm not going to say we should ban alcohol, but I do think that we should be thoughtful about how we have alcohol in the workplace. And I was talking about this at a conference, and right after some CEO came on, and they were talking, we just crush beer and code all day. And it's like, no, that is not okay. But that has become okay because he is saying it at a conference in front of hundreds of people. So, those are just the kind of sort of basic things that I just think needs to change. Crushing beer and crushing code isn't a very inclusive way to think about your workplace.
Pretty basic. Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. The good news is that this doesn't have to be, we have one more question.
I think we have time for one more.
I just had a quick question. So if you look at countries in Europe and Asia, it's much closer to parity even at the senior level. So what do you think they're doing differently from here that allows that?
So, I do think that this issue repeats itself basically everywhere, but there are a lot of cultural nuances that make each country and culture very different. And so in the Nordic countries, they've made a lot more progress. They have quotas. And even in countries in Europe where they don't have quotas, they actually feel the pressure of the countries that do have quotas. And that's where some of that really interesting research about increasing profitability and productivity is actually coming from. It's actually coming from countries in Europe. China is really interesting. I lived in China for 2 years, and I think it's very complicated. And we can't sort of say China good, US bad, or vice versa. Both countries have sort of a lot of issues to work out. Some people have said, look at the team at Alibaba, it's more female. Well, Jack Ma actually made it an explicit priority to get more women in executive positions. There are some, female entrepreneurs in China that have been more successful. China also had a one-child policy until 2 years ago, and women were having forced abortions. So I think that there are a lot of, there's a lot. It's not sort of an equal comparison. But you're right that the U.S. has a lot of really deep-seated cultural and stereotypical issues around this topic. The fact that we want work to be shared equally at work, but work at home is not shared equally at all still. There are so many, bigger cultural things that need to be done sort of in tandem. And, I so love that this movement is happening and that women and people are out there trying to bust down these walls, but it's really going to be brick by brick by brick.
And I think that is a great note to end on. This conversation does not end when you leave work. Emily, thank you so much for joining us. And like I said earlier, this doesn't have to be the last time that you hear from Emily. Our employee resource group, Women at LinkedIn, is co-hosting an event with Emily in May called Seat at the Table. For LinkedIn employees, you can go to go/seat at the table to sign up. And for anyone outside of LinkedIn that's listening and is interested, we have a bit.ly link for you. It's bit.ly/herseat. And for people who are still in the room, Emily is nice enough to stick around and sign books before she goes to Anchor later this afternoon, so be sure to take advantage of that. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next speaker series.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.